So in this video, a quick short little review of efficiency and surpluses. To start us off, we're going to talk about surplus, and in particular consumer surplus, because usually it's easier to understand. Individuals' consumer surplus is the idea that you get a certain amount of benefit that you didn't pay for when you bought a product. So if you remember, we would say it's the difference between what you paid and what you maximum would have paid. So the maximum, we'll say, and maximum you would have paid. And so like if I said to you, well, how much would you buy that burrito for versus how much did you pay for the burrito? Inevitably, you would have paid 10 cents more for the burrito or 50 cents more for the burrito. If you're at the burrito store and you're like, oh yeah, I want the burrito, you're not going to quibble over 10 cents, but that means that actually your maximum price for the burrito may have been $1 more than what you paid for it. And so the difference between those, if it's $1, then your individual consumer surplus is $1. And we would say that that's kind of considered the benefit that you obtained by engaging in the transaction. You obviously do not get a real dollar, right? That's not real, but in a sense, you get $1 worth of benefit because you're going, ooh, I got one over on the burrito store. I was willing to pay $7 for the burrito and they only charged me $6. So you have this kind of benefit. If we talked about total consumer surplus, it's adding up all the individuals. And so it's the area of all of them. So if we do it graphically, which we'll do in a moment, you could kind of add up like, well, if Bob got $1 and if Charlie got 50 cents and if Mr. Glossinger got 25 cents, then we would say that the total consumer surplus is $1.75. The same idea applies in producer surplus, and it's the difference between what the seller earned and the minimum they would sell for. So for example, that can be considered their marginal cost of producing that unit is another way to think about it. Because the idea is a little bit tougher to wrap your mind around, I think it's easier to think about just like what's the minimum thing they would sell it for is the cost they would do it, is selling at cost. But what they earned is the price they received, right? So it may be the same as the price of what you paid, or maybe there's a tax that's putting a difference between what you paid and what the seller got to keep, right? But for them, it's that same difference. And total producer surplus is adding up all the individuals. It's the same idea. So now we're going to draw a quick graph to show what these two ideas look like graphically. And it's going to be a supply and demand graph. So we're going to have quantity and price, and we're going to need a demand and a supply curve for this. So demand and supply. Now in this basic model, right, the price is the same for both, right? The price that gets paid versus the price the seller earns, that's the price. That's the equilibrium price. And I'm going to switch colors here for a second. And this is producer surplus. It's the difference between what they receive, which is the price, down to their cost of producing it, which is, or their minimum willingness to do it, which is that supply curve portion. And so if we fill in the area, right, of these, then that's just producer surplus. Now, likewise, if we think about the consumer surplus, we go from the price they paid, right, all the way up to the maximum they would have paid for each of those units. That is consumer surplus. And so we can fill that area in, and that is consumer surplus. Now remember that a triangle, right? I'm going to write this in a little bit easier to see here. A triangle area is 1/2 base times height. So just as a quick refresher, if you ever need to find the areas, that's how you find them. Now we're going to switch and talk a little bit about taxes because they sometimes mess with surplus a little bit. There are two different ways we think about types of taxes. One is in the percentage that gets collected and how that affects people, and the other is like the way that the tax is levied. So the first type, the percentage, right, is this type, percentage type, and then this one is how it's levied or how it's applied. So a progressive tax equals a kind where as income rises, tax percentage increases faster than income percent. A proportional tax is the kind where as income rises, tax percentage increases at the same rate. And so like this in the sense, like not the percentage that they pay, but it's like in some sense it is the percentage that they pay stays the same. So we would say like that if your income went up 20%, then your tax bill went up 20%. So the tax payments percent increases faster than income. So yeah, so it's really saying like what is comparing the rates and their rate of changes. In terms of a regressive tax, kind where as income rises, tax payments percent decreases compared to income. So in other words, if your income went up 20%, but your tax bill only went up 2%, then that would be a regressive tax. It wouldn't be particularly regressive, or it wouldn't be particularly proportional or even progressive in that sense. Lump sum taxes. Lump sum tax is where it's a fixed amount, and it occurs regardless of quantity of transactions. So this is like license fees, for example. Doesn't matter like if you cut 500 hair cuts a day or 5 haircuts a day, you have to pay a certain amount to be a licensed barber, right? That's the idea of a lump sum tax. A per unit tax is sometimes called an excise tax, occurs per transaction. And this is the kind that affects the supply curve. The other kind does not affect the supply curve. So I'm putting that in bold because it's the only kind that will affect the supply curve. Tax incidence is a measure of whether the buyer or the seller bears the burden of the tax, right? When we think about taxes, we often think that when we see it on the receipt, right, that from buying something at Target, that therefore we've paid the whole amount of the sales tax. In fact, we've shared the burden of that tax with the seller. If the tax was gone, we wouldn't pay the same price necessarily that this receipt says we paid. In fact, the seller would raise the price just a little bit and meet us somewhere in the middle between the price that we paid with the tax and the price that they got to keep. So it's a measure of who bears the burden. And the way that we can tell is through looking at the relative elasticities of the two. So if the buyers or the demand curve is more elastic than the sellers, then the buyers, what we call escape the tax. And this just simply means that the tax incidence primarily falls on the sellers. So whichever one is more elastic doesn't really have to pay it. And so we look at things here. If the sellers or the supply curve is more elastic, then the sellers escape paying the tax. And so that means that the tax incidence falls on the buyers. Think about maybe some concrete examples, right? For a tax on tickets to the World Series, right? Who has a more inelastic supply curve, or a more inelastic curve, the supply curve or the demand curve? Well, the demand for World Series tickets, those are a luxury product, so it's going to be a pretty elastic demand curve. And at the same time, World Series tickets to baseball, there's a fixed number of seats, so it's really inelastic supply. So if you put in a tax, who's going to escape it? The buyers. The buyers aren't going to really pay that much more with a tax. The sellers are going to pay it. Now, on the other hand, think about something like toilet paper, right? If we put in a tax on toilet paper, well, it's pretty inelastic demand. It's a necessity, and it's a small part of your income, so it's pretty inelastic demand, but it's relatively easy for the toilet paper people to ramp up production. I'm saying that now, of course, with all these toilet paper shortages in the back of my mind. But at the same time, it's relatively easy for them to ramp up production. So the sellers escape paying the tax, but the buyers bear the burden of it. Okay, the last topic here is about deadweight loss. This is the lost surplus value from a tax or other market failure. So it's the lost value of the transactions that didn't happen, that should have, or, the value of the transactions that did happen that should not have happened. And that's a strange concept a little bit when you think about it, because it's like, why would there be transactions that happened that should not have? Well, in a surplus or in a subsidy, right? The government subsidizing transactions. We often have transactions that should not efficiently happen, but do, because the government thinks it's important that they occur. So this is the lost value of transactions that didn't happen that should have, or the value of transactions that did not. And we've actually drawn it once already back in topic 1.5. So at this point, I will see you.